I looked down expecting overwhelming joy, but what I saw on my newborn son's skin, it shattered everything. I was just a homeless girl playing guitar on the rain-soaked streets of Seattle, desperate for a way out. Then a cold, powerful millionaire offered me a deal, have his child no strings attached for a fortune. But the moment our son was born, a unique birthmark appeared, a constellation that linked him to a past I knew nothing about and a secret Julian had buried deep. Could a mark on a baby's skin truly unravel a family's deepest mystery? What would you do if your past suddenly collided with an impossible future? My name is Grace, and this is our story. Listen to how we found our way home. The relentless drizzle of Seattle was less a rain and more a slow, insistent drowning. Grace huddled deeper under the flimsy, leaking awning of the defunct coffee stand in Pioneer Square, the thin fabric offering only the illusion of shelter. Water, cold and unforgiving, seeped through the brim of her worn beanie, tracing icy rivulets down her temples. Her primary mission, a sacred duty, was to shield her grandfather's battered guitar case, its chipped, once glossy surface now softened with age and wear from the persistent assault. The cardboard sign, hastily scrawled, that offered a vague promise of music for the soul, was already curling at the edges, dissolving into damp pulp. Just another ghost on the street, she murmured to herself, the words barely a whisper against the drumming of the rain. People hurried past, a blur of expensive umbrellas and determined strides, their eyes sliding right over her as if she were simply part of the grimy, moss-stained landscape. Invisible. That was her superpower, her curse. In a city of immense, unimaginable wealth, glass towers glinting with the reflected light of a distant, indifferent sun, she couldn't even scrounge enough for a single lukewarm cup of coffee. The irony was a bitter taste on her tongue, sharper than the biting wind. Her fingers, stiff and numb, found their familiar home on the guitar strings. A soft, melancholic tune, a bluesy, wandering melody that spoke of lost things and forgotten dreams, drifted into the damp air. She wasn't playing for money, not really. The few coins people occasionally tossed her way felt like pity, a crushing weight. No, this was for herself, a small, defiant act against the biting cold, against the gnawing hunger, against the suffocating weight of being utterly disregarded. It was a fragment of beauty she could still claim, a small, stubborn flame flickering against the vast, indifferent darkness. Then, a sudden, jarring disruption. A sleek black Audi R8, a predatory silhouette in the gray light, glided to the curb with barely a whisper of its engine. Grace instinctively tensed her hand, hovering over the worn neck of her guitar. She braced herself for the usual, a curt request for directions perhaps, or a dismissive wave to shoo her away from the expensive real estate. Instead, the driver's door swung open with a quiet thud and a man emerged. He was tall, impossibly so, draped in a perfectly tailored suit that seemed to repel the rain, not absorb it. His face, sharp and angular, was like a storm cloud, dark, intense, and utterly unreadable. Julian Croft. She didn't know his name then, but his presence hit her like a physical force. He didn't look at her with pity, the kind that made her skin crawl, nor with disgust, which she was accustomed to. No, his gaze was unnerving, an analytical intensity that seemed to peel back layers to see something she herself couldn't. "That chord progression," he stated, his voice a low rumble devoid of any warmth. "A G minor passing to a C sharp diminished. A rather poignant variation on the Wailing Willow of Donegal, isn't it?" Grace froze, her fingers still on the strings. It wasn't a compliment. It was an identification, precise and clinical, of a lesser-known folk ballad. Her grandfather had taught her a tune so obscure she'd never heard anyone else even hum it. This man, this stranger in the impossibly expensive car and flawless suit, had just in a single breath shattered her carefully constructed invisibility. He wasn't just seeing her, he was analyzing her. He didn't beat around the bush. "Get in," he commanded, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated awning. "You're getting soaked." Stunned, Grace hesitated, clutching her guitar. "What?" "I have a proposition," he interrupted, already turning his hand, gesturing towards the passenger door. "We'll discuss it somewhere dry." Before she could form another protest, he ushered her into the opulent interior of the Audi. The scent of leather and something subtly expensive, not a cologne, but a clean, sterile fragrance hit her first. Then the warmth. It was a shock to her rain-chilled skin, a luxury she hadn't felt in what felt like a lifetime. The Audi moved through the rain-slicked streets, a silent predator, until it pulled up to a private minimalist cafe in South Lake Union. The neighborhood, all gleaming glass and tech giants, felt like another planet. The cafe itself was an exercise in sterile luxury, polished concrete floors, stark white walls, and a single perfectly symmetrical bonsai tree on a brushed steel counter. No customers, no baristas. He had, she realized with a jolt, apparently kept it open just for this meeting. The contrast was stark, almost comical. Her wet, threadbare jeans and frayed sweater against the pristine, minimalist backdrop. Water dripped from her hair onto the gleaming floor, and she felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her. He meanwhile sat opposite her at a glass table, his posture impeccable, a single steaming cup of herbal tea placed before him by an unseen hand. A child, he stated, his gaze fixed on hers, unwavering. I need an heir. Grace's breath hitched. She stared dumbfounded, waiting for the punchline, the cruel joke. I am prepared to offer substantial compensation, he continued, as if discussing stock options. Housing, comprehensive health care, and a $1 million trust fund upon the child's birth and the relinquishment of your parental rights. He pushed a sleek black folder across the table. It's all in here. A standard contractual agreement designed for clarity and mutual benefit. He presented it like a business merger, a cold, calculated transaction. The absurdity of it hammered against her skull. A child. Her stunned, insulted to her core. Grace felt a hot flush creep up her neck, even as her mind, ever pragmatic, began to race. $1 million. It wasn't just money. It was a fortress. It was an escape from the freezing nights, the constant gnawing hunger that had become a familiar companion, the slow, agonizing erosion of her dignity. It was the promise of a roof, warmth, food safety, thing she hadn't known in years. She swallowed hard, her throat suddenly dry. Why me? She managed, her voice hoarse. A homeless girl with a guitar. What makes you think? He leaned forward slightly, his eyes still holding that unsettling, analytical intensity. I value resilience, Miss Hayes, and a distinct lack of existing entanglements. Your current circumstances, while unfortunate, present a unique set of advantages. He didn't elaborate, and his answer only fueled her suspicion. It was too cold, too precise. I need 24 hours, she finally said, her voice firmer than she felt, a desperate attempt to reclaim some control. He nodded, a barely perceptible dip of his head. Agreed. He reached into his inner jacket pocket and produced a small, sleek burner phone, placing it on the table. My number is pre-programmed, and this, he slid a key card across the glass. The address for the Astoria Suites is on the back. It's booked for you for the night. She stared at the phone, then the card. He was giving her a taste of the life he was offering, a gilded cage perhaps, but a cage nonetheless. Alone in the luxurious hotel room, the city lights a distant shimmering blur outside the panoramic window. Grace slowly turned on the shower. The water, gloriously, impossibly hot, stung her skin at first, then enveloped her in a cloud of steam. It had been months, no years, since she'd felt anything remotely like this. The grime of the streets, the damp chill that had become a part of her bones began to wash away. She stepped out, wrapped in a plush, oversized towel, and walked to the mirror. Her reflection stared back, a stranger, clean, yes, but still gaunt, with eyes too old for her years, haunted by things no teenager should ever see. The warmth of the room, the softness of the bed, the sheer intoxicating comfort of it all was seductive, a siren song to her exhausted soul. Her grandfather's face, kind and weathered, flashed in her mind, his gentle voice teaching her those obscure folk melodies, telling her stories of honor and self-worth. Never compromise who you are, little bird. Was this a compromise too far, to trade her body, her future, for a fortress of money? To give away a child, a piece of herself she hadn't even conceived of yet? The brutal reality of her situation clawed at her, the freezing nights, the gnawing hunger, the constant threat. $1 million wasn't just safety, it was survival. She walked to the bedside table, her bare feet sinking into the thick carpet, and picked up the burner phone. Its smooth, cold surface felt alien in her hand. Her thumb hovered over the call button, a tremor running through her arm. The reflection in the darkened window, overlaid with the distant city lights, was unreadable, a shattered mosaic of fear, desperation, and a terrifying, desperate hope. The burner phone, still cool in her palm, felt impossibly heavy. Every nerve in Grace's body screamed at her to throw it across the room, to run back to the familiar, albeit brutal, freedom of the street. But the lingering warmth of the shower, the soft embrace of the hotel's opulent bedding, was a powerful, silent argument. Her grandfather's voice, a gentle echo, whispered in her memory, reminding her of dignity. But survival, she realized with a cold clarity, sometimes demanded an agonizing pivot. Her thumb, still trembling slightly, pressed the call button. It rang only once before a crisp, disembodied voice answered. "Croft Residence." "It's Grace," she stated, her voice surprisingly steady, betraying none of the chaos swirling inside her. "I'm calling about the proposition." "One moment, please," the voice replied, impersonal and efficient. A click, then Julian Croft's voice, devoid of any preamble, cut through the line. "Have you made your decision, Miss Hayes?" "Yes," she said, her grip tightening on the phone. "I agree, but I have one condition." There was a beat of silence on the other end, a pause that stretched heavy with expectation. "And what might that be?" he asked, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. "My guitar," she stated, picturing her grandfather's worn instrument, her only true anchor to a past that still held warmth. "I keep it. With me. Always." Another silence, longer this time. Grace braced herself for an argument, a negotiation, a dismissive refusal. She had expected him to view it as a triviality, an indulgence. Instead, his response was curt, unexpected. "Fine," he said, the single word sharp and definitive. "A car will be there in precisely 1 hour. Be ready." And then just like that, he hung up. Exactly 60 minutes later, a sleek black sedan, not the R8 but equally luxurious, pulled up to the Astoria Suites. The driver, a man in a dark uniform and an impassive face, simply nodded, took her small, worn backpack and guitar case, and jesseled her into the back seat. The city lights blurred as they merged onto the highway, eventually crossing the monumental Highway 520 bridge. The twinkling expanse of Lake Washington spread out beneath them, a dark, glittering tapestry against the urban glow. The car finally turned into a secluded drive on Mercer Island, winding through ancient trees until a structure emerged from the darkness. It was a hyper-modern mansion, less a home and more a geometric sculpture of glass, steel, and stark white walls. It felt to Grace like stepping into a futuristic museum. Every line was precise, every angle deliberate. There was no warmth, no softness, nothing to suggest human habitation beyond its sheer intimidating scale. As the car glided to a silent stop, a woman stepped out from under the cantilevered entrance. She was tall, with severe dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, and dressed in an immaculately tailored charcoal suit. This was Evelyn Reed, Julian's assistant, as Julian had mentioned in the contract. Evelyn's composure was absolute, her professionalism impenetrable, yet as her gaze met Grace's, a flicker, just a breath of something warm, something almost like sympathy, softened the edges of her otherwise unyielding expression. "Welcome, Miss Hayes," Evelyn said, her voice calm and measured. "I am Evelyn Reed. If you would follow me, I'll show you to your suite and familiarize you with the house protocols." The tour was a blur of gleaming surfaces and silent spaces. Grace's suite was vast, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking panoramic view of Lake Washington, the city lights shimmering on the distant shore. But the windows, she quickly noticed, didn't open, not even a crack. They were sealed, soundproof, a transparent wall between her and the world she knew. Evelyn explained the intricacies of the house, the silent, unseen staff who maintained everything with uncanny efficiency. The ubiquitous, almost invisible security cameras and sensors, the strict schedule for her medical appointments. Your meals will be delivered to your suite at designated times, Evelyn explained, gesturing to a discreet service panel near the door. Any dietary preferences or needs can be communicated through the intercom. It was clear, efficient, and utterly dehumanizing. The first few weeks under contract blurred into a monotonous, sterile efficiency. Days melted into nights marked only by the arrival of silent meals prepared by a chef she never saw, and the constant, subtle surveillance. Julian Croft was a ghost. She never saw him in person. Her only contact came in the form of brief, formal text messages relayed through Evelyn. Dr. Albright will be conducting your next prenatal assessment at 0900 tomorrow. Prepare accordingly. Each message was a cold, impersonal directive, reinforcing the transactional nature of their agreement. Grace felt a new kind of isolation settle over her. Not the raw, biting loneliness of the street where she was disregarded but free, but the suffocating, insidious loneliness of a gilded cage. Here everything was provided, every need anticipated, yet she was utterly, profoundly alone. Her guitar, her one tangible connection to her past, became her solace. The warm, organic notes of wood and string felt jarringly out of place in the cold, pristine environment, a vibrant, defiant splash of color in a monochromatic world. She would sit for hours by the sealed window playing her melancholic tunes, the melodies echoing in the cavernous suite, unheard by anyone but herself. During one of her interminable medical exams, a new doctor, a stern, bespectacled woman named Dr. Albright, paused, her brow furrowed. "Miss Hayes," she began, her voice clinically detached, "we've reviewed your preliminary genetic markers. We require a more detailed family history, particularly regarding any unique dermatological conditions. Any history of, say, localized skin discolorations or unusual scarring on either side of your family." Grace blinked, surprised by the oddly specific question. I wouldn't know," she replied, a familiar ache starting in her chest. "I grew up in the foster system. I don't have any family history to give you. No parents, no grandparents beyond my grandpa who raised me. And he never mentioned anything like that." Dr. Albright simply nodded, making a note on her tablet, her expression unreadable. But later that day, when Grace recounted the strange query to Evelyn, she saw a flicker, a fleeting, almost imperceptible shift in Evelyn's perfectly controlled eyes, a hint of something knowledge, concern, regret, before it was swiftly masked by her usual mask of professional detachment. "I'll make a note of your response for Dr. Albright," Evelyn said, her voice smooth, dismissing the topic. One night, the sterile silence of the mansion felt particularly oppressive. Sleep refused to come. Grace, restless and feeling the walls close in, slipped out of her suite. The mansion was dark, eerily quiet. The only sounds, the soft hum of distant machinery and the whisper of her own bare feet on the polished floors. She wandered through the endless corridors, past rooms she hadn't even realized existed, until she found herself in a dimly lit wing she hadn't explored. A faint light spilled from a door slightly ajar. Julian's home office. Curiosity, a dangerous, irresistible pull, drew her closer. She strained her ears. She heard him speaking not on the phone but to himself, a low guttural sound raw with an emotion she'd never associated with the cold, precise Julian Croft. Peeking through the narrow gap, she saw him standing before a massive screen, a complex star chart projected onto it, constellations swirling in a digital cosmic dance. His back was to her, his shoulders hunched in a way that spoke of profound grief. "Leo," he whispered, the name tearing from his throat, imbued with a pain so deep it resonated in the silent house. It was a fragile, broken sound she wouldn't have believed possible from him. Before she could process the shock of what she was witnessing, before she could even think to retreat, he must have sensed her presence. The door swung open with a soft, almost imperceptible click. He was standing there, framed by the faint light of the star chart behind him, his face instantly reverting to a cold, impenetrable mask. His eyes, though, held a fleeting spark of something she couldn't identify, surprise maybe, or something darker. "You are not to come to this wing of the house again," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, each word a cold, precise shard of ice. The grief, the vulnerability had vanished, replaced by the familiar, unyielding intensity that chilled her to the bone. The confrontation with Julian in the hallway, the whispered name Leo, the haunting star chart, and his sudden ice-cold command left Grace profoundly unsettled. The memory of his grief-stricken whisper clung to her like a shroud, a stark contrast to the impenetrable mask he usually wore. He had shown a crack in his formidable facade, a glimpse into a pain so profound it resonated even with her own buried sorrows. But the door had slammed shut almost immediately, leaving her with more questions than answers. After that night, Julian became an even more distant, almost spectral presence in the sprawling mansion. His movements were now marked only by the soft click of a closing door from a remote wing, or the hushed rumble of his car leaving the driveway in the early morning before the sun had fully risen. Grace felt less like a surrogate carrying his child and more like a carefully monitored specimen, a prisoner in a house that, despite its opulence, was suffocatingly full of unspoken secrets. Every polished surface seemed to hold a silent accusation, every hushed corridor whispered of hidden narratives. In this isolating grandeur, Evelyn Reed became an unexpected anchor. Grace cautiously began to build a tentative rapport with the assistant, testing the waters with small, seemingly innocuous questions. "Evelyn," Grace asked one afternoon during one of Evelyn's brief scheduled check-ins, "this house, it's so different. Was it always like this?" Evelyn paused, her fingers hovering over her tablet, a rare, almost imperceptible hesitation. "Mr. Croft designed it himself," she replied, her voice still professional, but with a subtle inflection Grace hadn't heard before. "After a significant family tragedy some years ago. He hasn't been quite the same since." The words were clipped, but Grace felt the weight of them, the unspoken history they carried. Another time, as Evelyn was leaving Grace's suite, Grace stopped her. "Dr. Albright asked about my family's medical history, about skin conditions. It seemed strange." Evelyn's gaze met hers, and this time the flicker of concern was more pronounced, though quickly suppressed. "Some genetic predispositions can be complex, Miss Hayes. It's standard procedure for comprehensive prenatal care." Her explanation felt thin, unconvincing, and for a fleeting moment Grace felt a prickle of alarm. "I encourage you to focus on your well-being." Evelyn continued, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, "and to utilize all the resources this home offers. There's a fully equipped music room on the west wing should you be inclined." The suggestion was delivered casually, almost as an afterthought, but Grace sensed a subtle guidance in her words. Driven by a need for escape and by Evelyn's subtle suggestion, Grace sought out the music room. It was indeed on the west wing, tucked away behind a heavy soundproof door. Inside it was a revelation. Plush velvet seating walls lined with exquisite wood, and in the center, gleaming under a recessed spotlight, stood a magnificent grand piano. The sheer, overwhelming beauty of it took her breath away. It was a sanctuary, a silent promise of solace. She started spending hours there, retreating into its soundproofed embrace. Her old guitar, its familiar worn wood, a comforting weight, found a new resonance in the acoustically perfect space. But it was the piano that truly captivated her. She ran her fingers over the cool ivory keys, tentative at first, then with growing confidence losing herself in the cascade of notes. She began to compose her own music, raw, honest pieces that were a tapestry of her complex emotions. There was gratitude for the safety she now had, but also a simmering resentment for the freedom she'd lost. Fear for the future, for the life growing inside her, for the man who held her fate in his hands. And a growing unwelcome curiosity about Julian Croft, the enigma whose child she now carried. The music became her language, expressing what she couldn't articulate, a powerful emotional release in her gilded cage. One late afternoon, lost in a particularly intricate passage she was composing on the piano, Grace didn't hear him. Julian had returned home early, the soft whir of his car unheard over the swells of her music. He stood in the doorway of the music room, a silent, imposing figure, his expression utterly unreadable as he listened. The melody, a bittersweet blend of longing and defiance, filled the air. Grace, finally sensing a shift in the atmosphere, stopped playing abruptly, her fingers hovering above the keys. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the sudden silence. She expected a reprimand in order to cease her unauthorized activity. Instead, he walked slowly, deliberately towards the piano. He leaned over the sheet music she had been scribbling on, his gaze fixed on a particular section. "This transition," he said, his voice clinical, almost detached, yet completely focused on the music. "It could be stronger. If you modulate to the subdominant minor here, it adds a certain emotional depth." His long, elegant fingers, surprisingly graceful, then reached out and effortlessly played the passage on the grand piano, flawlessly executing the suggested change. The notes resonated rich and full, undeniably perfect. Grace was floored. Her mouth felt dry. How could this man so cold and analytical possess such an innate understanding of music, such technical prowess? How do you know so much about music?" She managed, her voice barely a whisper. He straightened, pulling his hand away from the keys as if burned. A shadow, dark and profound, passed over his face, momentarily stripping away his carefully constructed mask. His eyes for an instant held an ocean of grief. He looked away towards the large, soundproofed window, his jaw tightening. "My younger brother, Leo," he said the name, a raw, ragged sound filled with a sorrow that resonated through the room. "He was the musician, a prodigy." The finality in his voice was absolute, a door slamming shut on any further questions about this painful memory. He turned his shoulders stiff and walked out of the room, leaving Grace alone in the sudden echoing silence. The air was thick with the ghost of his brother, and with the stunning, unsettling realization that beneath Julian Croft's cold, impenetrable exterior, there was a deep artistic soul buried under layers of pain. The silence Julian left behind in the music room after revealing his connection to Leo was not empty. It vibrated with unspoken grief and a startling newfound understanding. Grace felt the invisible wall that separated them, previously unyielding, now fractured by a small significant crack. Julian didn't actively seek her out, but the sharp edges of his avoidance seemed to soften. Sometimes she would find a rare esoteric book on music theory, subtly placed on the grand piano or the side table in her suite, a silent offering, a hint of his awareness, and perhaps a form of acknowledgement. Their interactions, though still brief and stilted, began to revolve around composers, a shared, unstated language of notes and melodies. He might comment on a particular piece she was practicing, or she might venture a hesitant question about a classical composition he seemed to favor. Each exchange, though purely intellectual, felt like a bridge, however fragile, spanning the chasm between them. The day for the first ultrasound arrived, marked on her strict medical schedule. Grace expected Evelyn to accompany her, as she did for most appointments. Instead, a terse message from Evelyn that morning simply stated, "Mr. Croft will be driving you to this appointment personally." The ride to the clinic was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Julian drove the sleek Audi in silence, his profile a study in granite intensity. Grace watched the cityscapes blur past the window, her heart a nervous flutter against her ribs. What would this moment be like, shared with this complex, inscrutable man? The sterile clinic waiting room, the hushed voices, the scent of antiseptic. It all amplified her apprehension. Finally, they were in the examination room. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with warm eyes, greeted them gently. Grace lay back on the examination table, her hands clasped tightly over her burgeoning abdomen. Julian sat on a small stool near her head, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed on the blank monitor. As the doctor moved the transducer over Grace's skin, a wave of cool gel spreading across her belly, the room filled with a sound that instantly eclipsed all external noise. It was a rhythmic, whooshing thrum, a strong, steady beat, the distinct, undeniable sound of a heartbeat, her baby's heartbeat. Grace was utterly overwhelmed. Tears, hot and uncontrollable, welled in her eyes and streamed down her face, a messy, unplanned emotional release. It was real. This tiny, insistent rhythm, this faint heartbeat, was the undeniable pulse of a new life, a life connected to hers, a life she carried. Her breath hitched, a sob escaping her throat. Instinctively, her gaze flew to Julian. He was frozen absolutely still, his eyes wide and fixed on the monochrome screen where a tiny flickering speck was visible amidst the grainy shadows. His knuckles were white where he gripped the back of the chair, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle twitch. He wasn't looking at it like a successful project, a completed transaction, or an item checked off a list. No, his gaze was imbued with a profound, almost painful sense of awe, an unmasked vulnerability that stunned her. In that moment, for the first time, she saw the potential father, not just the cold, detached billionaire who had bought her. A raw, shared humanity hung in the air between them, thick and unexpected. On their way out of the clinic, the fragile bubble of their shared vulnerability was violently shattered. As Julian guided Grace through the discreet side exit, a blinding flash erupted. A paparazzo, clearly tipped off about the reclusive Julian Croft's presence at an OB/GYN clinic, burst from behind a parked car, his camera clicking furiously, capturing their image. Julian reacted instantly, his movements fluid and protective. He shoved Grace behind him, shielding her with his body, his broad shoulders a sudden solid barrier. Before the photographer could snap another shot, Julian's security team, seemingly materializing from thin air, swarmed the area, efficiently confiscating the camera and escorting the sputtering paparazzo away. The incident was jarring, a violent intrusion into their fragile private world, leaving Grace trembling, her heart racing with adrenaline. Back at the mansion, the adrenaline began to fade, leaving them both shaken and drained. Grace sank onto a plush armchair in the foyer, her hands still trembling. Julian stood over her, his initial anger at the photographer now tightly controlled, replaced by a fierce protectiveness. His face was etched with a rare, raw concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice tight with controlled fury, but it was directed at the violation they had just experienced, not at her. His intense eyes scanned her face, her body searching for any sign of distress. It was the most direct, most personal concern he had ever shown her, devoid of any transactional undertones. Grace, still emotional from the overwhelming experience of the ultrasound and the subsequent intrusion, could only manage a shaky nod. A single tear, a leftover from the earlier emotional deluge, traced a path down her cheek. He reached out his hand, hovering for a moment as if to touch her, then lowered it, clenching his fist. His voice, though still quiet, held an unshakable resolve. "No one will ever bother you again," he promised, his gaze unwavering. "I will handle it." The words hung in the air, a silent vow that went far beyond the terms of their cold, written contract. He was protecting her and the precious, nascent life inside her with a ferocity that surprised them both. The blurry photo, an invasive snapshot of Julian shielding Grace, spread like wildfire across the digital landscape. It sparked wild speculation. Who was the mystery woman with the reclusive tech mogul? Was it a secret relationship? A new business venture? Julian's formidable PR team worked overtime, swiftly scrubbing the image from the most prominent platforms, issuing vague, dismissive statements. But the damage was done. The outside world had breached their carefully constructed sanctuary, leaving an unsettling residue of vulnerability. In response, Julian implemented even tighter security protocols, an almost invisible net of surveillance that became a constant humming presence in the mansion. Yet paradoxically, the incident had a strange, unintended effect. It forged a subtle, almost imperceptible bond between them, a "we're in this together" mentality born from shared exposure and Julian's unexpected protectiveness. A few days later, a discreet message from Evelyn arrived, not on her tablet, but hand-delivered on a small embossed card. "Mr. Croft requests your presence in his study at 2000 tonight." Grace's heart gave a nervous flutter. The study, the forbidden wing. She dressed carefully, choosing a simple dark sweater, feeling a prickle of anticipation mixed with apprehension. When she arrived, the heavy door to Julian's study, the same door that had been ajar that night, was now fully open, a silent invitation. Julian stood before the massive projection screen, the same star chart glowing behind him, its celestial bodies swirling in intricate patterns. He looked different tonight, less rigid, a hint of vulnerability clinging to him like a faint aura. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice softer than usual. He gestured to the screen. "Do you recognize this constellation?" Grace peered at the intricate patterns of light. "Ursa Minor," she replied, remembering a childhood book. "The little bear." He nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible dip of his head. "Indeed. And the brightest star at the end of its tail. Polaris, the North Star." He paused, his gaze distant, lost in the shimmering cosmos on the screen. "My younger brother Leo, he was obsessed with Polaris. He saw it as a constant in a chaotic universe, a fixed point. He was a brilliant astronomer and a musician." His voice, when he spoke the last words, cracked just slightly. "He died in a rock climbing accident. He was 19. The confession hung in the air, raw and poignant. Grace listened, her heart aching for him, for the unimaginable loss he had carried for so long. The cold, analytical shell she knew him by began to crumble, revealing the wounded man beneath. "We were orphans," Julian continued, his voice strained, a testament to the effort it took to unlock these painful memories. "Raised by a distant uncle who cared little for anything but his investments. I was the older one, the protector, always pragmatic, always planning. Leo, he was the dreamer. He saw beauty and numbers in the stars and melodies." Julian turned from the screen, his gaze meeting hers, full of a self-recrimination that was almost unbearable to witness. "I blame myself for his death. I was supposed to be with him on that climbing trip. We had planned it for months, but I canceled at the last minute for a business meeting." His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in his temple. His death, my grief and guilt, they morphed into a relentless drive for success, for control. A way to build a world where nothing unexpected, nothing outside my influence could ever hurt me again. A fortress. His eyes, usually so sharp, seemed clouded with remembered pain. "This heir, it isn't for business, Miss Hayes. It's to continue a family line that I feel I let die. A legacy that should have been his." The weight of his confession pressed in on Grace, a heavy shared grief. She understood the fortress, the desperate need for control. "I understand," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. She shared her own story, a raw, unflinching account of her own losses. "My parents, they died in a car crash when I was 16. Just gone. Then my grandfather, he took me in, he was everything to me, but he had a sudden illness and the hospital bills, they consumed everything. Left me with nothing, forced me onto the streets." Her voice faltered slightly, remembering the cold, the hunger, the utter despair. A profound, quiet understanding settled between them, a bond forged in the crucible of shared loss. They were both survivors of profound, unimaginable grief, both adrift in a world that had, in different ways, taken everything from them. In that moment, the transactional nature of their agreement faded, replaced by an unexpected, genuine connection. As Grace was about to leave, the confession weighing heavily, she glanced at the star chart again. Her eyes fell upon a small, faint cluster of stars, near Polaris, almost invisible amidst the brighter constellations. A familiar pang went through her. "My grandfather," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "He called that the shepherd's hook. He told me it was our family's lucky charm." Julian froze. His gaze snapped from her to the screen, his analytical mind already racing. He leaned forward, zooming in on the seemingly insignificant cluster. The stars were there, undoubtedly a faint scattering of light, but they were uncatalogued as a recognized group. He pulled up an advanced astronomical survey, cross-referencing databases. The stars remained uncatalogued as a specific cluster. He looked at Grace, his eyes burning with a new intense curiosity, the calculating intensity returning, but now tinged with a profound wonder. "What was your grandfather's name?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the question hanging in the charged air, hinting at a mystery far deeper than either of them could have imagined. Evelyn's warning, her voice low and urgent, hinting at a connection between their families, a darker truth behind Julian's relentless investigation, settled over Grace like a chilling mist. It reawakened the cautious, street-hardened part of her that had begun to soften under Julian's unexpected warmth. She started observing him more closely, every gesture, every guarded glance trying to decipher his true motives. Was his kindness genuine, born from a burgeoning connection, or was it a calculated part of his relentless investigation into her past? The ambiguity was torturous, leaving her in a constant state of unease. She felt like a chess piece moved by unseen forces in a game she desperately longed to understand. One afternoon, Julian surprised her. "The nursery is complete," he announced, his voice lacking its usual detachment, a hint of anticipation in its tone. "Would you like to see it?" Grace braced herself, expecting the room to be a continuation of the mansion's stark, hyper-modern aesthetic, cold, clinical efficient. Instead, what she stepped into disarmed her completely. It was warm, beautiful, bathed in a soft, ethereal light, filtering through sheer curtains. The furniture was handcrafted, designed with gentle curves and natural wood. One wall was a breathtaking hand-painted mural of the night sky, deep blues and purples swirling with countless luminous stars. And there, subtly glowing amongst them, was the Ursa Minor constellation, its familiar shape picked out in shimmering silver. But the true marvel was in the center of the ceiling, a custom mobile meticulously crafted, depicting the tiny, faint cluster of stars her grandfather had called the Shepherd's Hook. He had created it, given it form and presence. "I wanted the child to have," Julian began, his gaze fixed on the mobile, his voice almost a whisper, "a piece of both of us, a connection to the vastness and to the comfort of home." The gesture was so profoundly thoughtful, so deeply personal, that it completely shattered her lingering wariness. The weight of Evelyn's warning seemed to dissipate in the gentle glow of the painted stars. He wasn't just a calculating billionaire. He was trying in his own awkward way to connect, to offer a piece of his vulnerable, hidden self. As the weeks turned into months, the nursery became their shared space, a neutral ground where their theoretical co-parenting became increasingly real. They started discussing names, a seemingly innocuous topic that quickly led to their first real argument. "Leo," Julian stated one evening, his voice firm, leaving no room for discussion. "If it's a boy, he will be Leo." Grace felt a pang, sharp and immediate. It wasn't just a name. It was a ghost, a replacement, a burden placed on an unborn child. "Julian," she said gently, her voice carefully modulated, "I understand what Leo means to you truly, but shouldn't this child, your child, have his own identity, his own name?" His jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a raw, unexpressed pain. "You don't understand my grief," he accused, his voice low, controlled, but vibrating with a fierce intensity. "You don't understand what it means to lose everything." "And you," she countered, her own voice rising, slightly fueled by a surge of protectiveness for the life within her. "You don't understand what it's like to carry a child, to feel them grow, and know you're planning to place an impossible burden on their tiny shoulders before they even draw their first breath." The argument wasn't loud or angry, but it was tense, emotional. Each word carefully chosen, yet delivered with the force of deeply held convictions. It ended in a stalemate, a brittle silence settling between them as they retreated to their separate wings of the mansion. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, a soft knock came at Grace's door. Julian stood there, his shoulders slightly slumped, his face shadowed. Can I come in?" he asked, his voice hesitant, almost uncharacteristically unsure. She nodded, her heart still aching from their earlier clash. He stepped inside, not meeting her gaze directly. "You're right," he admitted, his voice raw, stripped bare of its usual control. "You're absolutely right. It's not fair to him. To place Leo's memory, my grief, on this child." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound weariness. "My deepest fear," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper, "is that I will fail this child, just as I feel I failed my brother." Seeing him so vulnerable, so utterly broken, Grace's own defenses crumbled. She reached out her hand, finding his, a simple, instinctive act of comfort. Her fingers closed over his, warm and steady. The touch, so gentle yet so firm, seemed to shatter the last of his composure. He didn't sob loudly, but a profound, silent sorrow shook his frame. She felt it through his trembling hand, a visceral connection to his pain. She held his hand, offering him a silent anchor, a connection he hadn't allowed himself in years, perhaps ever. In this raw, intimate moment of shared vulnerability, his secrets finally spilled out, tumbling into the quiet room. Leo didn't just fall, he revealed, his voice strained, hushed. An old faulty carabiner, a piece of climbing gear. It failed. It was a gift from our estranged grandfather. His voice hardened, laced with a bitter contempt. A man I despised. After Leo's death, as I was going through his things, I discovered something else. My grandfather. He wasn't my biological relative, nor Leo's. Grace gasped, her eyes widening. Our mother. Julian continued, his gaze locking onto hers, full of a desperate, searching intensity. She had a secret affair before she died, before she married the man we thought was our father. My birth certificate was falsified. I've been searching for my real maternal family ever since, hoping to find a connection to the mother I never truly knew, hoping to understand. He squeezed her hand, his gaze piercing. Your grandfather, Elias Vance, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper laden with a shocking implication. He had the same rare surname as the man I believe was my mother's lover, Evans. Evelyn's warning, her voice low and urgent, hinting at a connection between their families. A darker truth behind Julian's relentless investigation settled over Grace like a chilling mist. It reawakened the cautious, street-hardened part of her that had begun to soften under Julian's unexpected warmth. She started observing him more closely, every gesture, every guarded glance, trying to decipher his true motives. Was his kindness genuine, born from a burgeoning connection? Or was it a calculated part of his relentless investigation into her past? The ambiguity was torturous, leaving her in a constant state of unease. She felt like a chess piece moved by unseen forces in a game she desperately longed to understand. One afternoon, Julian surprised her. The nursery is complete, he announced, his voice lacking its usual detachment, a hint of anticipation in its tone. Would you like to see it? Grace braced herself, expecting the room to be a continuation of the mansion's stark, hyper-modern aesthetic, cold, clinical, efficient. Instead, what she stepped into disarmed her completely. It was warm, beautiful, bathed in a soft, ethereal light filtering through sheer curtains. The furniture was handcrafted, designed with gentle curves and natural wood. One wall was a breathtaking hand-painted mural of the night sky, deep blues and purples swirling with countless luminous stars. And there, subtly glowing amongst them, was the Ursa Minor constellation, its familiar shape picked out in shimmering silver. But the true marvel was in the center of the ceiling, a custom mobile meticulously crafted, depicting the tiny, faint cluster of stars her grandfather had called the Shepherd's Hook. He had created it, given it form and presence. I wanted the child to have... Julian began, his gaze fixed on the mobile, his voice almost a whisper, a piece of both of us, a connection to the vastness and to the comfort of home. The gesture was so profoundly thoughtful, so deeply personal, that it completely shattered her lingering wariness. The weight of Evelyn's warning seemed to dissipate in the gentle glow of the painted stars. He wasn't just a calculating billionaire. He was trying in his own awkward way to connect, to offer a piece of his vulnerable hidden self. As the weeks turned into months, the nursery became their shared space, a neutral ground where their theoretical co-parenting became increasingly real. They started discussing names, a seemingly innocuous topic that quickly led to their first real argument. Leo, Julian stated one evening, his voice firm, leaving no room for discussion. If it's a boy, he will be Leo. Grace felt a pang, sharp and immediate. It wasn't just a name. It was a ghost, a replacement, a burden placed on an unborn child. Julian, she said gently, her voice carefully modulated, I understand what Leo means to you truly, but shouldn't this child, your child, have his own identity, his own name? His jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with a raw, unexpressed pain. You don't understand my grief, he accused, his voice low, controlled, but vibrating with a fierce intensity. You don't understand what it means to lose everything. And you, She countered, her own voice rising, slightly fueled by a surge of protectiveness for the life within her. You don't understand what it's like to carry a child, to feel them grow, and know you're planning to place an impossible burden on their tiny shoulders before they even draw their first breath. The argument wasn't loud or angry, but it was tense, emotional, each word carefully chosen, yet delivered with the force of deeply held convictions. It ended in a stalemate, a brittle silence settling between them as they retreated to their separate wings of the mansion. Later that night, long after the house had fallen silent, a soft knock came at Grace's door. Julian stood there, his shoulders slightly slumped, his face shadowed. Can I come in?" he asked, his voice hesitant, almost uncharacteristically unsure. She nodded, her heart still aching from their earlier clash. He stepped inside, not meeting her gaze directly. "You're right," he admitted, his voice raw, stripped bare of its usual control. "You're absolutely right. It's not fair to him to place Leo's memory, my grief, on this child." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of profound weariness. "My deepest fear," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper, "is that I will fail this child, just as I feel I failed my brother." Seeing him so vulnerable, so utterly broken, Grace's own defenses crumbled. She reached out her hand, finding his, a simple, instinctive act of comfort. Her fingers closed over his, warm and steady. The touch, so gentle yet so firm, seemed to shatter the last of his composure. He didn't sob loudly, but a profound, silent sorrow shook his frame. She felt it through his trembling hand, a visceral connection to his pain. She held his hand, offering him a silent anchor, a connection he hadn't allowed himself in years, perhaps ever. In this raw, intimate moment of shared vulnerability, his secrets finally spilled out, tumbling into the quiet room. Leo didn't just fall. He revealed, his voice strained, hushed. An old faulty carabiner, a piece of climbing gear. It failed. It was a gift from our estranged grandfather. His voice hardened, laced with a bitter contempt. A man I despised. After Leo's death, as I was going through his things, I discovered something else. My grandfather. He wasn't my biological relative, nor Leo's. Grace gasped, her eyes widening. "Our mother!" Julian continued, his gaze locking onto hers, full of a desperate, searching intensity. "She had a secret affair before she died, before she married the man we thought was our father. My birth certificate was falsified. I've been searching for my real maternal family ever since, hoping to find a connection to the mother I never truly knew, hoping to understand." He squeezed her hand, his gaze piercing. "Your grandfather, Elias Vance," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper laden with a shocking implication. "He had the same rare surname as the man I believe was my mother's lover. Evans, your grandfather, Elias Vance." Julian had said, his voice dropping to a near whisper laden with the shocking implication. "He had the same rare surname as the man I believe was my mother's lover, Evans." The revelation hung in the air between them like a thundercloud, a bombshell that reframed everything. His initial interest in her, his intense obsession with her past, the strange questions about her family's medical history, it all clicked into place with a terrifying, bewildering clarity. Were they, however distantly related? The thought sent a dizzying mix of shock and a bizarre, almost fated sense of destiny through Grace. The $1 million contract, the very foundation of their arrangement, now seemed like a cosmic joke, a twisted prank played by the universe. They sat there for a long time, hands still clasped, the weight of the possibility pressing down on them. Finally, Julian broke the silence. "We need a DNA test," he murmured, his voice tight. "But not now. After the baby is born." Grace understood. The truth, whatever it might be, felt too monumental to process while a new life was growing, while their fragile, evolving connection was still so raw. They implicitly agreed to wait, afraid of what the full truth might change between them now in this delicate space. The third trimester began bringing with it a new wave of physical discomfort for Grace. Her body felt heavy, unwieldy, a vessel carrying an increasingly demanding passenger. Yet ironically, she felt emotionally closer to Julian than ever before. The boundaries of their contract, once so rigid, continued to blur, dissolving into the easy rhythms of a real couple. He would often read to her belly at night, his deep voice rumbling through the chapters of classic literature, a soothing lullaby for the unborn child. She in turn found herself helping him navigate his anxieties about impending fatherhood, offering reassurance, listening patiently to his fears of repeating past failures. They laughed more easily now, the mansion, once a sterile, impersonal space, slowly but surely transforming into something else, a home. Grace's pregnancy cravings, meanwhile, became legendary within the mansion's unseen staff. One particularly late evening, a sudden, overwhelming urge for the most bizarre combination struck her. "Julian," she mumbled, half asleep but entirely serious, I need pickles and mint chocolate chip ice cream. Together." Julian, ever the man of action, undertook the midnight quest with the solemn focus of a scientist launching a satellite. He returned an hour later, looking both utterly exhausted and ridiculously proud, clutching a bag of dill pickles and a tub of her requested ice cream. "Mission accomplished," he announced, his eyes gleaming with a triumph usually reserved for multi-billion-dollar deals. Then the storm hit. A massive, furious tempest rolled in over Lake Washington, transforming the tranquil waters into a churning, angry expanse. The sky turned an ominous bruised purple, and the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the massive glass panes of the mansion. With a sudden jarring flicker, the house was plunged into darkness. The hum of technology, the constant low thrum of the servers and security systems died away. The silence was absolute, broken only by the relentless drumming of rain against the windows and the banshee wail of the wind. The primary security systems were down, running only on essential backup generators that cast a faint emergency glow in the hallways. They were trapped, completely isolated from the world. In the sudden, profound darkness, they gravitated towards each other. Julian, with surprising efficiency, located the kindling and logs. Soon a fire crackled to life in the grand fireplace of the living room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In the flickering firelight, with the storm raging outside, the last vestiges of pretense of the cold contract fell away completely. The fear, the secrets, the carefully maintained distance, it all melted, leaving only the two of them illuminated by the primal glow of the flames. He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, no longer trembling with grief, but with a different kind of raw emotion. "Grace," he began, his voice low, husky, barely audible above the storm. I'm falling in love with you." The confession hung in the air, electric, shattering the last of her doubts. "You've brought life back into this mausoleum, into me." His thumb traced patterns on her skin, a tender, possessive gesture. Tears, warm and unexpected, welled in Grace's eyes. She squeezed his hand, her heart overflowing. "I feel the same, Julian," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion, the words tumbling out unbidden from the depths of her soul. I can't imagine leaving you, or the baby. This has become my home. You've become my home." In the flickering light, with the storm raging around them, he leaned in, his eyes dark with desperate emotion, and their lips met. It was a passionate, desperate kiss, sealing a promise that had nothing to do with a $1 million contract and everything to do with the family they had accidentally, miraculously created. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the roar of the fire, the beat of two hearts, and the silent, profound hum of a future they both now fiercely desired. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world freshly washed and glistening in the dawn. But the real tempest had raged within the mansion forever, altering the landscape of Grace and Julian's lives. In the quiet aftermath, their relationship was fundamentally changed. The contract, once a rigid framework, felt like a forgotten document in a dusty drawer, irrelevant and insignificant. They were a couple bound by shared vulnerability and a fierce, undeniable love. They spoke openly now, planning for a future where they would raise their child together, a future that stretched beyond the initial transactional agreement. The question of their potential genetic link, The chilling possibility of distant familial ties still hung in the air between them, an unspoken truth they implicitly agreed to defer, choosing instead to focus on the present, on the palpable reality of their growing family. Julian decided he no longer wanted to hide. "It's time," he told Grace, his gaze firm, resolute. "Time to face the world, together." He arranged a carefully managed interview with a respectable journalist, a woman known for her discretion and integrity, not the sensationalism of the tabloids. The day of the interview, the mansion buzzed with a different kind of energy, a quiet anticipation. When the cameras rolled, Julian, usually so guarded, sat beside Grace, his hand resting casually, possessively on her knee. He introduced her not as a surrogate, but as his partner, his voice steady and clear. He told a modified yet truthful version of their story, focusing on their shared healing from past traumas, the unexpected connection that had bloomed in the most unlikely of circumstances, and their profound excitement for their future as a family. It was a powerful act of defiance against the secrets, against the wild speculation, a public declaration of their new reality. As her due date drew closer, Grace decided it was time to sort through some of her grandfather's old belongings, which Julian had carefully stored for her in a climate-controlled unit. It felt like a necessary step away to bring a piece of her past into their shared future. Tucked away in a dusty box beneath faded photographs and forgotten trinkets, she found it a small, leather-bound journal. It was her grandmother's, its pages brittle with age. Most of it was filled with mundane daily entries, recipes, gardening notes, observations about the weather. But tucked carefully in the very back, almost hidden, was a faded sepia-toned photograph. It showed her grandmother as a young woman, her smile radiant, standing beside a handsome young man, his arm loosely around her. On the back, in elegant looping script, was an inscription, "With my dearest Thomas, summer of '85. The man was not her grandfather, Elias. Her breath hitched. A cold premonition, a creeping sense of inevitability washed over her. She knew instinctively before she even showed it to Julian. She found him in his study, immersed in a holographic projection of complex data. "Julian," she said, her voice a little shaky, holding out the old photograph. "Look at this." He took it, his brow furrowing as he studied the faded image. His eyes, usually so quick to analyze, widened almost imperceptibly. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small framed photo, an old picture of his mother, youthful and vibrant. He held them side by side. The resemblance was uncanny, chillingly so. Julian's mother and Grace's grandmother. They were clearly sisters. The man in Grace's photo, Thomas, had the same intense, piercing eyes as Julian. A silent, staggering truth descended upon them, binding them together in a way that was both profound and deeply complicated. Julian's father wasn't the man his mother had been married to, and it seemed Grace's father wasn't the man her mother had been married to. Both sisters had had an affair with the same man, Thomas Evans, the very Thomas Evans Julian had been searching for, the man he believed was his mother's lover, the man whose surname was Evans. This made Grace and Julian half-cousins. The revelation was staggering, a cosmic irony that twisted their already extraordinary journey into something even more improbable. The shock had barely begun to settle when a sharp, searing pain tore through Grace's abdomen. She gasped, doubling over. "Julian," she whispered, her voice strained. It's time." He looked at her, his face draining of color. "But it's weeks early." He stammered, the cold, calculating billionaire replaced by a man utterly terrified and helpless. Another wave of pain hit, more intense this time. Complications, sudden and serious, surged through her. Panic, raw and unbridled, seized him. He scooped her into his arms, his movements surprisingly swift, but his eyes were wild with fear. As they raced through the mansion, then through the dark, rain-slicked streets in his car, Julian's usual composure vanished. He drove with a reckless abandon she'd never witnessed, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, muttering frantic reassurances to himself more than to her. Grace, despite her own escalating pain and fear, found herself needing to be the calm one. She reached out, clutching his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Whatever happens," she told him, her voice strained, but firm, a beacon in his terror, "we're in this together." The sterile bright lights of the hospital emergency entrance rushed towards them, a harsh, unforgiving glare on their uncertain future. The sterile bright lights of the hospital emergency entrance rushed towards them, a harsh, unforgiving glare on their uncertain future. The world outside the car dissolved into a blur as Julian, his face a mask of terror, navigated the chaotic entrance. Inside the emergency room was a whirlwind of hushed urgency, nurses, doctors, and the piercing sound of alarms. Grace was immediately wheeled away, her grip on Julian's hand, the only anchor in the rising tide of pain and panic. The labor was difficult, a grueling, terrifying ordeal that stretched for what felt like an eternity. Grace fought through each contraction, the pain a fiery wave consuming her. Julian was by her side the entire time, his meticulously constructed walls completely gone. His face, usually so composed, was etched with raw fear and profound helplessness. He held her hand, his grip crushing yet comforting, whispering encouragement, meaningless words that somehow grounded her. In the midst of the chaos and pain, they were a team, a family facing this unknown together. The world outside their small, desperate bubble ceased to exist. Then a new sound, a small, vulnerable cry that cut through the tension in the delivery room like a bolt of lightning. The baby was here, a healthy baby boy. He was placed on Grace's chest, a tiny, squirming bundle of warmth and life. Grace's breath hitched. She looked down at him, her vision blurred by tears of exhaustion and overwhelming emotion. Love, a fierce, primal wave of it washed over her, erasing all the pain, all the fear, everything but this perfect, miraculous being. His tiny fingers curled around her own, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. Julian, kneeling by her side, was openly weeping, unashamed. His face, usually so stoic, was a mask of awe and profound relief streaked with tears. He reached out a trembling finger, gently stroking the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "Hello," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, utterly undone. A nurse, her movements gentle and practiced, then carefully took the baby to clean him. As she turned him over to wipe his back, Grace's breath caught in her throat, her eyes fixed on a spot just below his tiny shoulder blade. It wasn't just a random splotch of color. It was a small, perfect, unmistakable cluster of marks, shaped exactly like the shepherd's hook star pattern. The same faint, uncatalogued constellation her grandfather had cherished, the one Julian had painstakingly recreated as a mobile in the nursery. Julian saw it too. He stumbled back as if struck, his face draining of all color, going from flushed with emotion to an ashen white. He stared at the small birthmark, his eyes wide with disbelief, horror, and something akin to terror. "No," he whispered, the single word torn from his throat. "It's not possible." It was the shock from the story's title, yes, but it wasn't a shock of rejection or revulsion. It was a shock of pure, unadulterated disbelief, an impossible echo from the past manifesting itself in the present. Almost immediately, as if summoned by the sheer weight of the moment, a new figure rushed into the room. A doctor, older, with kind but grim eyes, the head of neonatology, his lab coat billowing behind him. He had clearly been alerted by the attending nurse, whose own face was pale with a mix of shock and confusion. The doctor's gaze went from the baby's unique birthmark to Julian, then back to the baby. "Mr. Croft," the doctor said, his voice heavy with significance, cutting through the stunned silence. "I was a resident under Dr. Alistair Finch 20 years ago at Seattle Children's. I remember your brother Leo." His eyes flickered to the baby again. He had the exact same birthmark, in the exact same location. We documented it as a nevus of Ota, but the pattern was unique. We called it the Croft constellation. The implication hung heavy and impossible in the air. This child, Grace, and Julian's child, was by some unfathomable medical or genetic miracle, a living, breathing echo of the lost brother. The child Julian had sought to honor Leo's memory bore Leo's own unique mark, a chilling, miraculous resonance from the past. The doctor's words hung in the sterile air, heavy with impossible significance. The Croft constellation, a birthmark identical to Leo's on their newborn son. Julian's stunned whisper, "No, it's not possible," echoed in the quiet room. It was a miracle, a haunting, terrifying miracle that defied logic and shattered every preconceived notion. The hospital room became a whirlwind of medical consultations and urgent genetic testing. Doctors, their faces a mixture of professional curiosity and genuine bewilderment, swarmed around them. They spoke in hushed tones of genetic chimerism, of recessive traits, skipping generations, of epigenetic memory, complex theories that swirled around Grace's exhausted mind, none of them fully accounting for the uncanny, identical, uniquely patterned birthmark. The DNA test they had planned, the one they'd agreed to defer until after the baby's birth, now took on a new desperate urgency. Julian insisted on it, immediately needing answers, needing to understand this baffling echo from the past. The results came back quickly, delivered by the geneticist himself, his expression a mixture of awe and professional satisfaction. And the truth, when it finally emerged, was the story's final stunning twist. "Miss Hayes, Mr. Croft," the geneticist began, his voice calm, cutting through the palpable tension in the room. "The good news is there's no familial relationship between you two. None at all." Grace stared. "But my grandmother and Julian's mother, Thomas Evans." "A complete coincidence of names and locations, Miss Hayes," he confirmed. "Your grandmother's photo was likely with an old friend. No genetic link. Your grandfather, Elias Vance, was indeed your biological grandfather. The name Evans in Julian's family tree and your family's history simply led to a series of misinterpretations, understandable given the circumstances." The relief was immediate, a physical weight lifting from Grace's chest. The bizarre, complicated layer of potential familial ties dissolved. They were not related. The contract, the initial premise of their relationship, felt even more like a strange, fated dream. However, the geneticist continued, turning to Julian, his voice serious, "The mystery of the birthmark. That's where things become truly extraordinary, Mr. Croft. Your own DNA test revealed something incredibly rare. You are what we call a human chimera." Julian's brow furrowed, a flicker of his old analytical intensity returning. "A chimera." "Yes," the doctor explained patiently. "You carry two sets of DNA. Your own and a small distinct amount of your fraternal twin brother's DNA, absorbed in the womb very early in gestation. That brother, he was Leo's identical twin, never born, absorbed by you. Julian, you don't just feel like you lost a brother. You biologically carry the ghost of two." The words hung in the air, a profound, almost cosmic revelation. It was this absorbed DNA, the genetic material of Leo's identical unborn twin, that had been passed on to his son. This, the geneticist explained, accounted for the miraculous, impossible reappearance of the Croft constellation birthmark, a trait that only Leo, and by extension his identical twin, had possessed. The shepherd's hook was indeed Grace's family charm, but the specific pattern on their son was Leo's. This revelation shattered Julian's entire understanding of himself, of his life, and of his profound, suffocating grief. His guilt was not just for one brother, Leo, but for two. His world, built on logic and control, crumbled under the weight of this impossible, miraculous truth. He finally had a biological explanation for the profound, almost supernatural connection he had always felt to Leo, a bond that transcended mere siblinghood. He stumbled back, sinking into a chair in Grace's hospital room, tears streaming down his face, not just from sorrow, but from a profound, agonizing catharsis. I was supposed to protect them," he choked out, his voice raw, broken. "Both of them. And I failed. I failed them both." He confessed all his fears, the immense burden of guilt he had carried for 2 decades, the desperate need to control everything to prevent another loss. Grace, tears streaming down her own face, reached out and pulled him close, holding him as he finally broke. She was his anchor, the solid presence he had always needed. "You didn't fail Julian," she whispered, stroking his hair. "This child, he's not a ghost. He's not a replacement. He's a miracle, a second chance, A chance for you to love and protect without the burden of the past. A chance to finally heal. She held him as his silent, profound sobs racked his body, offering him the comfort and acceptance he had been denied for so long. Days later, the baby was strong enough to be moved to a private room. Julian sat by the incubator, gazing at his sleeping son, his face softer than Grace had ever seen it. He talked to the baby, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He told him all about his Uncle Leo, not as a legend to live up to, not as a burden, but as a wonderful, creative man who would have loved him fiercely. He promised the baby that he would let him be whoever he wanted to be, free from any expectations or the weight of a past he didn't have to carry. Then he looked up at Grace, his eyes clear for the first time, free from the ghosts of the past, free from the crushing weight of grief and guilt. A gentle, loving smile touched his lips. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the original contract, their first cold agreement. With a decisive movement, he ripped it in half, then again, letting the pieces flutter into the small trash can beside the bed. "Our story starts now, Grace," he said, his voice imbued with a newfound hope and boundless love. "All of us, together." The ripped fragments of the contract fluttering into the trash symbolized not an end, but a beginning. Julian's face, clear of the ghosts that had haunted it for 2 decades, was a beacon of newfound hope and boundless love. "Our story starts now, Grace," he had said, his voice a promise. "All of us together," and so it did. 1 year later, their new reality was a vibrant montage of life, laughter, and an unfolding future. The cold, gleaming Mercer Island mansion, once a symbol of Julian's grief and control, had been sold. In its place, they found a warm, sprawling home nestled in the verdant countryside outside Seattle, a haven of natural light filled with the scent of pine and the endless possibilities of open space. There was plenty of room to run, to breathe, to simply be. The stark white walls had been replaced with soft, inviting colors, and the silence with the joyful clamor of a family truly alive. Julian, once the impenetrable tech mogul, was a profoundly changed man. He was still brilliant, still driven by an insatiable intellect, but his work was now beautifully balanced by his family. The stark lines of his face had softened, and his eyes, once so guarded, now held a constant warmth, especially when he looked at Grace or their son. He was a doting, hands-on father, immersing himself in every aspect of fatherhood with the same meticulous focus he once applied to algorithms. He'd stepped back from the relentless CEO role at his company, delegating much of the day-to-day operations to his capable team, to focus instead on a philanthropic foundation he'd established in Leo's name. It funded young artists and aspiring astronomers, a living legacy that honored his brother's passions without burdening their son. Grace had blossomed, shedding the last vestiges of the street-hardened girl she once was. Her talent, once a quiet act of defiance, was now given the space to truly flourish. She was attending a prestigious music conservatory in Seattle, her days filled with scales compositions and the joyful camaraderie of fellow musicians. She was a confident, loving mother, instinctively nurturing, and an equal partner to Julian, her voice now strong and clear in all their decisions. Her relationship with Evelyn had deepened into a true, unwavering friendship. Evelyn, with her dry wit and unwavering loyalty, had embraced her role as the baby's godmother, a cherished member of their unconventional family. They had named their son Orion Evans Croft. Orion for a new constellation, vast and brilliant, a symbol of endless possibilities. Evans, to honor Grace's past her own identity, and the surprising thread that had inadvertently led her to Julian. And Croft, to connect him to the family that loved him fiercely, to the legacy Julian was now transforming. They called him Rio, for short, a name that tasted of sunlight and adventure. The story ended with the three of them, a perfect self-contained universe, lying on a soft blanket in their sprawling backyard, under a clear, star-dusted night sky. 1-year-old Rio, gurgling with delight, reached his tiny hand up towards the shimmering pinpricks of light, his eyes wide with wonder. Julian, his arm around Grace, was pointing out the constellations to their son, his voice soft, filled with a quiet reverence. "And that one," he said, his finger tracing a familiar path across the inky blackness, Right there, the brightest one in Ursa Minor, that's Polaris, the North Star. He paused, a gentle smile gracing his lips. That was your Uncle Leo's favorite. He said it was the anchor of the sky, the one thing you could always count on to find your way home. Grace looked at Julian, his profile silhouetted against the vast expanse of stars, then at their son, his small hand still reaching. A profound sense of peace settled over her, warm and encompassing. She, a girl who once had no home, who had wandered invisible through the relentless rain, had finally found her own North Star, not a single point of light in the sky, but the warmth and love of the two people beside her. The thought resonated deeply within her, a quiet, absolute truth that echoed the beating of her heart. We were home. Hello, friends. As our story of Grace and Julian comes to a close, I hope you felt the echoes of their journey in your own hearts. From the lonely streets to a house of sterile luxury, and finally to a home filled with boundless love, their path was anything but conventional. What can we take from this unexpected tale? Perhaps it's that home isn't always a place but a feeling, a profound sense of belonging forged in shared vulnerability, in unexpected kindness, and in the courage to let down our walls. Julian, once bound by guilt and a desperate need for control, found freedom in the very connection he sought to orchestrate. Grace, who felt invisible, discovered her worth not in wealth, but in the love she gave and received. Life often throws us storms, doesn't it? Just like the one that plunged Julian's mansion into darkness, stripping away all pretense. It's in those moments of chaos, when our carefully constructed lives are shaken, that we often find our truest selves in the people who truly matter. It reminds us that even when all seems lost, a new constellation can form, a new path can emerge. This story also speaks to the profound, almost miraculous ways we heal. Julian carried a burden of grief and guilt that shaped his entire existence. But through grace and through the birth of their son, he found a release, a chance to transmute that pain into purpose and unconditional love. We often seek to control our destinies to avoid pain, but sometimes the most beautiful things bloom from the most broken places. The universe, in its infinite wisdom, often conspires to bring us exactly what we need in the most surprising packages. So I leave you with this thought. Where do you find your North Star when the world feels chaotic? What unexpected connections have guided you home? And are you willing to let go of your own carefully constructed walls to embrace the miracles life might have in store? If this story made you think, please leave a comment below. We'd love to hear your reflections. If you have a different perspective or a story of your own resilience, share it with us in the comments. And if you enjoy stories that touch your soul and challenge your perceptions, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next video. Until then, keep looking for your light.